Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. The most 90s box art of all time, the Sega Genesis gets an anime platformer, and the NES finally gets some proper Dungeons & Dragons. I'm your host, Jared, and today is April 22nd, 1992. One of the most popular game genres at the time was the beat 'em up, made famous by games like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game and Final Fight. This spawned many copycat clones, including Rival Turf, released for the Super Nintendo on April 23rd, 1992. It has everything you'd expect from a beat 'em up game, walking from left to right and punching the ever-living crap out of every single dude who dares to walk on the screen. You sometimes pick up health items or weapons, then fight a boss at the end of the stage. And that's pretty much the whole game. So how do you get a game like Rival Turf to stand out against all the other competitors? That's easy, with box art. Look at this. This is the most 90s box art I could possibly think of. Leather jackets, backwards baseball caps. This is perfect. It worked too. Imagine me at 7 years old, walking into a Blockbuster for a game to rent, seeing this box art and thinking to myself, oh, cool kids. I want to be a cool kid. Watch out, Mom. I'm going to be hanging out with the badass 14, maybe 15-year-olds. Funnily enough, I think these two are supposed to represent the two playable characters in the game, who are named Jack Flack and Uzi Nelson. Ugh. And that's not the only thing that got changed in translation. In Japan, this game is known as Rushing Beat and is actually the first part in a trilogy of games. However, the Western Rival Turf had all the cutscenes completely removed. Its sequels did make it to the Western market, where you may know Rival Turf 2 and 3 as Brawl Brothers and The Peacekeepers. Only now those games are completely unrelated and have their character names changed further. What makes Rival Turf better than something like Final Fight? Absolutely nothing. In fact, it's way more boring compared to any other beat-em-up game. Even reviews at the time were super unimpressed. It's so painfully mediocre that it's super forgettable. So how does it keep showing up everywhere? In 2011, it was made available on the Wii's Virtual Console. It was also put onto the Wii U's Virtual Console in 2015. And in 2017, Retrobit released a special SNES cartridge that included Rival Turf and its sequels. But how? The owner of the game, Jalico, went out of business in 2014. So who keeps getting this re-released? Oddly, the one thing I remember the most was the boss on the third stage. He was this hockey mask wearing boss, and he would jump on the fence to taunt me, but like, he's definitely just giving me the finger, right? That wasn't the only game that came out this week with a completely different cover in the US. There was also Alisia Dragoon, released for the Sega Genesis. The gameplay has you playing as Alisia, running and jumping while blasting every single enemy you see with some fantastic magical effects. She also has familiars following her around with their own different abilities and ways of helping. I can't stress how great this game looks and plays. The large character sprites are sweet, and the lightning shots are so satisfying to hit enemies with, and the soundtrack is awesome. Now, in the 90s, publishers weren't convinced that gamers over here would want to play a game that has an anime character on the cover, let alone a girl. That's one of the reasons why Mega Man 1 and 2 had such weird box art. The same also applies to Alisia Dragoon. The Japanese box art is really cool and very evocative. But I gotta hand it to the US box art here. I love this style of 90s, where every dude is shirtless and super buff, and every woman is mostly shirtless and also super buff. While I wasn't able to confirm it, this art style is very reminiscent of Boris Vallejo, who also did the box art for games like Golden Axe 2 and Eternal Champions. And if it wasn't him, it very well could have been his wife, Julie Bell. If anyone knows for sure, please let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to find out. Because this box art, it's fantastic. Did I mention that Studio Gainax designed the characters for this game? You know, the same studio who also did Neon Genesis Evangelion. Sadly, Alisia Dragoon didn't exactly light up the sales charts. I think it's safe to say that most people either didn't know it existed or chose to ignore it. Seriously, I flipped through several issues of EGM around the time and I couldn't find a single mention of it. Not a review, not an advertisement, not even a cheat code. However, it must have some form of a cult following of an underappreciated classic. When Sega released the Sega Genesis Mini in 2019, included right on there was Alisia Dragoon. Over on the NES, we saw the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Pool of Radiance. It's fundamentally a first-person dungeon crawler where you and your party travel through dungeons and towns. You'll talk to NPCs and when battle occurs, switch to an overhead turn-based strategy to do combat. These battle screens aren't just random walls popping up. The battles take place where you are on the map, down to every single hallway, door, and corridor. While other D&D games for the NES up to this point were either a stupid platformer or a stupid side-scrolling whatever, Pool of Radiance was a faithful port. Originally, it appeared for MS-DOS computers as part of what's known as the Gold Box D&D games by developer SSI. And that game was massive, making its appearance onto the 8-bit Nintendo downright impressive. Not only that, it still retained all the best things, being able to create your entire party and do battle with an incredibly accurate version of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition rule set, complete with THAC0. It may graphically leave a few things to be desired, but the NES version of Pool of Radiance does have a few things going for it that the computer version doesn't. For one, it has music everywhere. And that's it, I guess. It certainly isn't better than the home computer version, but AD&D Pool of Radiance on the NES is a great version of an already great Dungeons & Dragons game. This week, I counted 1 Genesis game, 2 Super Nintendo games, and 1 NES game, giving us a pretty harmonious pie chart. There were no major franchises released in this time, so the biggest release may actually be Rival Turf, if only because it's a zombie game that won't die off. Over in the collector's corner, nobody cares about Rival Turf. A loose cartridge is worth around $15, though I've personally seen this at the bottom of reseller bargain bins for like $5. Even a complete version is pretty cheap for an SNES game. Alisia Dragoon, on the other hand, is by far the biggest gainer as it sold so few copies. A lone cartridge can be worth as much as $80, and if you still have the awesome box art and manual, you're nearing a couple of hundos. Pool of Radiance is obscure enough of an NES title that it's got a pretty respectable cartridge price. Though if you want to get yourself a complete in-box copy, it's not too much more expensive at about $130. And that's it. Next week, we have Marvel's First Avenger, another anime game only deformed, and the Sega Genesis finally gets some whip action. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Don't forget to click subscribe if you aren't already, like the video, and leave a comment down below, especially if you've heard of any of these games, or maybe you still own Alisia Dragoon. No one else knows about Alisia Dragoon, and more people need to know about it. Seriously, go play Alisia Dragoon, everybody.